The Air War over Germany, 1943 to 1945. American bomber crews flew daylight missions deep into Nazi Germany in B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, facing German fighters and anti-aircraft fire that created a killing zone in the skies over Europe. Before long-range fighter escorts arrived, bomber losses were catastrophic. Some missions saw 20% losses, meaning a crew's statistical chance of surviving 25 missions was nearly zero. Over 26,000 American airmen were killed in the skies over Europe, flying missions that destroyed Germany's ability to make war, but cost a generation of young men who flew into hell at 25,000 feet.
Welcome back, everyone. Today I want to tell you about one of the most dangerous jobs in World War II. Not infantrymen charging machine gun nests, not sailors on ships being torpedoed, but young men flying bombers deep into Germany. Men who climbed into aircraft every morning, knowing there was a very good chance they wouldn't come back. Men who watched their friends' planes explode in midair, then had to fly the same mission the next day. This is the story of the American Air War over Germany, the bomber crews who flew into hell at 25,000 feet. When America entered World War II, the Army Air Forces had a theory about strategic bombing. They believed that heavy bombers, flying in tight formations and bristling with machine guns, could fly deep into enemy territory, bomb military and industrial targets with precision, and fight their way through enemy defenses without fighter escort. It was called daylight precision bombing. The British had tried daylight bombing and taken such terrible losses they'd switched to night bombing. But the Americans believed they had better bombers, better tactics, and better equipment. They believed they could make it work. The primary American bomber was the B-17 Flying Fortress. It was a beautiful aircraft. 4 engines, 10 machine guns, could carry up to 8,000 pounds of bombs, and had a crew of 10 men. The name Flying Fortress suggested it was invincible, bristling with defensive firepower. The reality was very different. Starting in 1943, American bomber groups began flying missions from England into occupied Europe and Germany. The early missions were to targets in France and the Low Countries, closer targets where German defenses weren't as strong. But soon the bombers were going deeper, into Germany itself, to Berlin, to the industrial cities of the Ruhr, to the ball bearing factories at Schweinfurt, to the oil refineries at Ploiești. And that's when the Air Force learned that the theory of daylight precision bombing didn't match the reality of combat. Second Lieutenant Robert Morgan from North Carolina flew a B-17 named Memphis Belle. He later described what it was like. You'd take off from England in the morning, form up with hundreds of other bombers, and head for Germany. For hours, you'd fly in tight formation, watching for German fighters. The closer you got to the target, the worse it got. First, the flak. Anti-aircraft fire would start. Black puffs of smoke filling the sky, each one a shell that could tear your plane apart. Then the German fighters would hit you. Me-109s and FW-190s, coming in fast, guns blazing.
The German fighters had figured out American bomber tactics. They'd attack head-on, where the B-17's nose had the fewest guns. They'd concentrate on one bomber at a time, shooting it out of formation where it became an easy target. They'd use cannon fire to knock out engines or kill crew members. And the flak was murderous. German anti-aircraft guns fired shells that exploded at predetermined altitudes, filling the air with shrapnel. Bomber crews had to fly straight and level during the bomb run. No evasive maneuvers, no matter how heavy the flak. They had to hold formation and give the bombardier time to aim and drop the bombs. Flying straight and level while German shells exploded all around you took incredible courage. Staff Sergeant John Lucky Luckadoo from Texas, a ball turret gunner, remembered the flak was the worst. You could see it coming, black clouds appearing in the sky ahead. You knew you had to fly through it. You'd hear the shrapnel hitting the plane, bang, 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 like someone throwing gravel. You'd see planes get hit, catch fire, start going down. And you couldn't do anything but sit there and take it. The casualty rates were staggering. In 1943, before long-range fighter escorts became available, some missions saw losses of 20% or more. 20%. That means 1 out of every 5 planes didn't come back. Crews were required to fly 25 missions before they could go home. Mathematically, with 20% losses per mission, most crews wouldn't survive. Let me put that in perspective. A B-17 crew was 10 men. If you flew 25 missions with 20% loss rates, statistically, you had about a 3% chance of surviving. 3%! Young men in their early 20s were climbing into aircraft every morning knowing those odds. The mission to Schweinfurt on October 14, 1943, became known as Black Thursday. The target was ball bearing factories. Germany needed ball bearings for everything from tanks to aircraft. Destroy the ball bearing production and you hurt Germany's entire war machine. 291 bombers took off for Schweinfurt that morning. They flew deep into Germany without fighter escort. The P-47 fighters of the time didn't have the range to escort them all the way to the target and back. For hours, the bombers were on their own, facing waves of German fighters and intense flak. 60 bombers were shot down. 60. That's over 20% losses. Another 17 were so badly damaged they had to be scrapped. Over 600 airmen were killed or captured. Some bomber groups lost over half their aircraft.
Lieutenant Harold Weekly flew that mission. He later said, "I've never seen anything like it. German fighters everywhere, attacking in waves, planes going down all around us. We'd see a B-17 get hit, catch fire and spiral down. Sometimes you'd see parachutes, sometimes you wouldn't. We kept flying, kept holding formation, because that's all we could do." After Schweinfurt, the Air Force realized they had a serious problem. They couldn't keep taking these kinds of losses. They needed long-range fighter escorts, fighters that could stay with the bombers all the way to the target and back, fighting off German interceptors. The answer was the P-51 Mustang. With drop tanks for extra fuel, the P-51 could escort bombers deep into Germany. It was also an excellent fighter, faster and more maneuverable than most German fighters. When P-51s started escorting bomber missions in early 1944, everything changed. The Germans now had to fight through American fighters to get to the bombers. German fighter losses increased dramatically. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe was losing experienced pilots faster than they could train replacements. German pilots with hundreds of hours of training were being replaced by teenagers with minimal training. The balance was shifting in favor of the Americans. But bomber crews were still dying. Even with fighter escort, even with declining German resistance, the missions were deadly. Living on a bomber base in England was surreal. You'd wake up, have breakfast, get briefed on the day's mission, you'd see which crews were flying, which weren't, you'd climb into your aircraft, fly an 8-10-hour mission into Germany, face death for hours, and if you survived, you'd land back in England, have dinner, maybe go to a pub, sleep, and do it all again the next day.
And always, you'd notice the empty bunks, the crews that didn't come back. Their belongings would be collected, new crews would move into their bunks, and the war would continue. Technical Sergeant Forrest Vossler from New York, a radio operator, described it: you'd make friends with guys, and the next week, they'd be gone. Shot down, killed, or if they were lucky, captured. You learned not to get too close to people because they might not be there tomorrow. But you couldn't help it. You were living together, flying together, depending on each other. So you made friends anyway, and you grieved when they didn't come back.
The different positions on a bomber crew had their own dangers. The pilot and co-pilot sat up front, responsible for flying the plane, exposed to head-on fighter attacks. The bombardier and navigator were in the nose, vulnerable to flak during the bomb run. The waist gunners stood at open windows, exposed to wind, cold, and incoming fire. The ball turret gunner sat in a tiny sphere under the plane, with barely room to move and no way to escape if the plane was going down. The tail gunner sat isolated in the back, watching the formation and fighting off attacking fighters. Every position was dangerous. Every mission could be your last. And the psychological stress was enormous. Imagine flying a mission, watching planes get shot down, seeing men die, wondering if your plane will be next. Then landing, trying to sleep, and knowing you have to do it again tomorrow, and the day after, for 25 missions. Some men broke. Combat fatigue, what we'd now call PTSD, was common among bomber crews. Men who'd flown dozens of missions sometimes couldn't take it anymore. They'd freeze up, unable to climb into the aircraft. The Air Force tried to be understanding, but there was pressure to keep flying. The war had to be fought, missions had to be flown. The targets the bombers hit were varied. Industrial centers like the Ruhr Valley, oil refineries and synthetic fuel plants, aircraft factories, submarine pens, railroad marshalling yards, ball bearing factories. Sometimes precision was possible. Bomb sites were sophisticated and bombardiers were trained, but often, especially when cloud cover obscured the target, bombing was less precise. Cities were hit along with military targets. German civilians died. This was strategic bombing, attacking the enemy's ability to make war by destroying their industry, infrastructure, and resources. It was controversial then and remains controversial today. Did strategic bombing shorten the war by crippling Germany's war economy? Or did it waste resources and kill civilians without significantly affecting Germany's ability to fight? Historians still debate these questions. What's not debatable is the courage of the bomber crews. Whatever you think about the strategy, those young men were following orders, doing their duty, and dying in huge numbers to carry out that strategy. They deserve respect for their service and sacrifice. By 1945, the air war over Germany had been won. The Luftwaffe was destroyed. German cities were in ruins. German industry was crippled. Allied bombers flew missions with minimal opposition. The bomber crews had accomplished their mission, but at terrible cost. Over 26,000 American airmen were killed in the air war over Europe. Another 28,000 were wounded. Over 20,000 were shot down and became prisoners of war. Of the roughly 110,000 American airmen who flew combat missions over Europe, about 80,000 became casualties, killed, wounded, or captured. That's a 73% casualty rate. Think about that. If you were a bomber crewman, you had almost a 3 in 4 chance of being killed, wounded, or captured. Those are terrible odds. And yet, young men kept volunteering, kept climbing into those aircraft, kept flying into German airspace. The stories of individual bomber crews are remarkable. The Memphis Belle, piloted by Robert Morgan, was one of the first B-17s to complete 25 missions. Their story was made into a documentary during the war and a Hollywood movie years later. They were lucky. They survived when so many didn't. Other crews weren't as lucky. The crew of Lonesome Polecat was shot down over Germany on their 24th mission, one mission short of going home.
The crew of Hell's Angels completed 48 missions, far more than the required 25, before they were finally retired. Some crews were shot down on their first mission. It was a terrible lottery. The bond between bomber crew members was intense. These men depended on each other completely. If the pilot made a mistake, everyone died. If a gunner didn't spot an attacking fighter, everyone died. If the bombardier couldn't find the target and they had to make another run through the flak, everyone might die. They lived together, flew together, and often died together. Sergeant Lewis Smith from Michigan, a waist gunner, said, "Your crew was your family. You trusted them with your life every time you went up. The pilot, the navigator, the other gunners, you'd die for them and they'd die for you. When you lost a crew, you didn't just lose friends. You lost brothers." The physical conditions in a bomber at 25,000 feet were brutal. Temperatures could drop to 50 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Crew members wore heated suits, but frostbite was common. The waist gunners stood at open windows where the wind howled through at 200 miles per hour. Your hands would go numb. Your oxygen mask would freeze. Your machine gun would jam from the cold. And you'd be at altitude for hours, 8, 10, sometimes 12 hours, breathing through an oxygen mask the entire time because there wasn't enough oxygen at that altitude. If your oxygen system failed, you'd pass out and die. If your heated suit failed, you'd freeze. All while German fighters tried to shoot you down and flak exploded around you.
The air war over Germany was won by 1945, but the lessons learned came at a terrible price. The theory of unescorted daylight bombing proved disastrously wrong. Fighter escort was essential. The courage and determination of bomber crews couldn't overcome the mathematics of attrition when losses were 20% per mission. But the bomber offensive did accomplish its goals. German industry was crippled. Oil production was destroyed, grounding the Luftwaffe and immobilizing German armor. Transportation networks were shattered. The German war economy was in ruins by 1945. Whether this justified the cost in American lives and German civilian deaths remains debated. What's certain is that the men who flew those missions were heroes. They volunteered knowing the odds. They flew mission after mission, watching friends die, knowing they might be next. They did their duty, even when the cost was almost unbearable. Today, there are museums dedicated to the air war over Europe. The National Museum of the U.S. Air Force in Ohio has B-17s and B-24s on display. The American Air Museum at Duxford in England honors the American airmen who flew from British bases. These museums preserve the aircraft and tell the stories, ensuring that future generations remember what those airmen did. The air war over Germany was one of the most brutal campaigns of World War II. More American airmen died in that campaign than Marines died in the entire Pacific War. The casualty rates were higher than infantry in most battles, and yet they kept flying. Every day, when the weather permitted, bombers would take off from England, form up over the Channel, and head for Germany. And every day, some wouldn't come back. Thank you for listening. And never forget the bomber crews who fought the air war over Germany. They flew into hell at 25,000 feet day after day, mission after mission. They watched their friends die and kept flying. They faced odds that should have broken them and kept fighting. They were the true heroes of the air war, and they paid a terrible price.
The air war over Germany was a hell like no other. Over 26,000 brave American airmen were killed, 28,000 wounded, and more than 20,000 captured as prisoners of war. Out of roughly 110,000 who flew, 80,000 became casualties, a staggering 73%. These were young men,
barely out of their teens, who volunteered to face near certain death to carry out missions that destroyed Germany's war machine. Every flight was a lottery of survival, every mission a brush with the void. War is an abomination, a machine that devours lives and shatters souls. Those who start it are cowards and monsters. Remember the names, the faces, the sacrifices. Never forget the courage, the pain, and the lives lost in the skies over Europe.